Relationships are threads that tie us together. These threads knit patterns that shape and unfold and influence our lives. You can think about the neighbor who told you about your first job, or the kid from school who introduced you to your first love. These events are not random. These relationship ties connect us to the formation of our social networks. And lots been written about social networks, and their power is easy to see, because we see it in our own lives that the people we know have made us the people we are. We see that power. But today I want to talk about a power you do not see. Invisible ties connect us to people we've never met before and to places we've never been. We may not know how, but invisible threads tie us to a broader community tapestry. Now, I want to be clear though, invisible doesn't mean any less powerful. So take this for example. You walk into a restaurant you've never been to before. You're seated at a table in a room full of strangers. Now, research shows you're more likely to overeat if the random stranger sitting next to you overeats. Why? The invisible power of social influence. And here's another one. Let's say a friend of your neighbor has started to volunteer at a local community center. Now, you don't know the friend, you've never been to the community center before, and frankly, you don't even know that the friend is volunteering at the community center. Nonetheless, research shows that your likelihood of civic engagement increases when that friend starts to volunteer. Why? Again, it's the invisible power of social influence. And here's another one. Let's say you know someone who's become a victim of gun homicide, which, by the way, happens in the United States about 30 times a day. By simply knowing someone who knows someone, your odds of either killing someone or being killed increase by 900%. Why? Again, the answer is the same. It's the invisible power of social influence. Now, invisible ties are often underestimated, but they're incredibly powerful. They have the ability to shape a community and to break a community. This is a talk about the invisible power you never knew you had. Now, when I was invited to give this talk, they said, Tracey, we want you to speak because we think what you're going to say will make people feel uncomfortable. Like, great. Okay, so here goes, some uncomfortable facts. According to America's National Safety Council, the average American stands about 500,000 to 1 chance of becoming a victim of gun violence. If you're male, those odds increase 6-fold. If you're African American or Black, your odds increase 6-fold again. These events are not random. They're heavily influenced by social structure, networks, and influence. Now, invisible ties and invisible networks are often underestimated, because they seem random. But if you look closely, patterns begin to emerge in the fabric. Now, the ability to detect these patterns is exactly at the heart of a statistical method called social network analysis. But you can relax, this is not going to be talk about stats. It's going to be talk about how ordinary people like you and me can use our power of social influence to shape and change the community around us. So here's an example. The Baton Rouge Area Violence Elimination Program, or BRAVE, is a community intervention that's based on this idea that violence in a city can be amplified or suppressed based on social influence. It's modeled off of a group violence reduction strategy known as Operation Ceasefire. It's been implemented in cities across the country. And the premise is this: the bulk of violent crime in most communities is committed by a small handful of people. And if you look closely at those people, you see that they're very much interconnected. They know each other. They commit crimes with each other. They commit crimes against each other. By understanding the ties that connect these individuals, a few things can happen. First, it becomes much easier to identify who's likely to become a victim of violent crime and who's likely to commit a violent crime. And I want to be clear, when I say violent crime, I mean violent crime. I'm talking about murder, aggravated assault, aggravated rape. I'm not talking about lesser crimes like burglary or theft. Another thing that happens is it becomes a lot easier to track violent criminals. Because if you think about it, it's really difficult to monitor and track hundreds and hundreds of people at once. But if you're able to reduce them to interconnected groups, tracking becomes a lot easier. And that's a good thing because law enforcement in most cities is stretched pretty thin and under-resourced. By arming officers with evidence-based knowledge about known violent offenders, it helps law enforcement use their resources more efficiently, and it also protects innocent citizens from being unfairly targeted. Now, when I was invited to join Brave, it was as a social network analyst. Essentially, they were wanting to understand how these ties work together, which threads to cut, and which threads to tie. Now, to be perfectly honest, as much as I was familiar with crime in the city, very much wanted to help, I had no background in law enforcement. I'm an organizational scientist. I'm an academic. So I did the first thing that academics do when they're faced with a monumental challenge. I ran to the library, read everything I could about gangs and gang structures, but all the while, I just had this idea in my head, this image of the Godfather. And I knew it couldn't be right. I needed a more authentic feel. So I did the next thing academics do, is I left the university and went to the heart of gang intelligence to talk with local law enforcement, undercover agents, prosecutors, Homeland Security, and FBI. But more than that, I went into the field to talk with social workers, service providers, faith-based leaders, victims, and residents of their communities. Because you see, in order to understand how to reduce crime in a city, you have to take a step back and look at the broader fabric. So from all of these discussions, a new image started to form in my head, and one that was the departure from that media image. Because if you're like me, when I say gang, you might think of the Bloods and the Crips. And this image is salient, but it's not accurate. It misrepresents group crime the way it exists in most cities. Most street gangs are pretty unsophisticated. They're loosely bound. Now, they're dangerous, don't get me wrong, but it just doesn't fit that media image. And in fact, what's been most striking to me as an organizational psychologist is how very human a lot of the influences are and the motivations are that drive people to do some of the most heinous things. I'm reminded that what's rational is very much context specific. Unimaginable behavior happens in unimaginable circumstances. So, if you would, put aside your image of gang for a moment and think about this. 14-year-old boy growing up in North Baton Rouge, we'll call him Jared Jones. Jared's father is absent, his mother's inconsistent, and he's being raised by his grandmother. Now, his grandmother's very concerned because lately Jared has been very withdrawn, he's been very down, because one of his friends has been spending a lot of time with a new group, and one that's known to cause trouble. Jared's starting to feel pressure to follow suit. He fears for his safety if he doesn't. He fears for his future if he does. He's caught. So, an important thing to think about in terms of understanding Jared's behavior in his situation is the factor of, one human factor of need for survival or the drive to survive. From birth, we're programmed with the drive for building a sense of self and a sense of survivability. So what does this mean for Jared? Well, it means that he's looking for a sense of stability. He's looking for a sense of identity. He's looking for acceptance. He wants to be liked. People like to be liked. Even gang members like to be liked. At a Brave meeting once, a prosecutor mentioned knowledge that there would be a party held by one of the gang members the following night. So how did this prosecutor know that a party was going to happen? Because he was invited to it. And just wanted to dispel any notion that this was some kind of setup or Hollywood thing. No, this was a genuine invitation. The gang member really wanted the prosecutor to go. He wanted to be seen in a positive light, like a likable guy. Even gang members want to be liked. And even gang members want to be good at what they do. Coincidentally, tracking people who are good at being deviant is a hallmark of Brave. Careful consideration, lots of data gathering, sophisticated analysis go into identifying those people who are most likely to kill or be killed. It goes into identifying which groups are most violent and the people within them. All this effort culminates in what's called a call-in. A call-in is a gathering of faith-based leaders, community service providers, law enforcement, victims, their family, all of whom come together to deliver a message to select gang members. And it's this: the violence has to stop. Walk away from the life of crime, accept free services to start your life anew, or continue what you're doing and face the harshest penalties. Now, it's a very impactful message. And I want you to think, though, about the logistics of a situation like this. So in a small courtroom, you have some of the most violent people in the entire city who are sitting side by side next to rival gang members, like people they've sworn to kill. And so, as you can imagine, the invitation list is very small, it's very selective. Only those who are most likely to kill or be killed next are invited. Now, when we had our first call meeting, we really didn't know what to expect. I mean, we didn't even know if anyone would show up. But not only did we have record attendance by national standard, 4 people who weren't even on the list showed up. They were incensed that their reputations had gone overlooked. So, even gang members want to be good at what they do. When you think about it, though, being a gang member is both an identity and an occupation. But even still, it's not the dream job most hoped for. It's kind of a plan B. It's something that happened along the way. So a sense of acceptance, a sense of survivability, a sense of stability, all of these things are part of the picture. Now, in thinking about that, you might be wondering, though, how a drive for survive connects to the world's deadliest occupation. But think about it this way. Whether or not Jared aligns himself with a gang or resists, his odds of encountering violence are astronomical. According to research conducted in Jared's neighborhood, 80% of teenagers know someone who's been shot. 40% of teenagers have seen someone had a gun pulled on them. 10% of teenagers have either had shots fired at them or they've witnessed someone actually get shot. I'd like to think that most people would want to avoid a life in a gang. But when the horizon is short and the violence is inevitable, a band of brothers can provide a sense of identity and security that is human for all of us to want. Now, the good news is that these same influences that draw Jared into the life of crime are the same ones that can save his community. And Brave capitalizes on this in a couple of ways. So I've already mentioned that the network analysis can be used to identify network gang structures. But progressive law enforcement tells us that policing cannot solve violence alone. Because you have to take a step back. It's not one thread that draws Jared into the life of crime. It's multiple threads. It's tangles of threads from his community, his school, his home life, his own life expectations. To reduce crime in a city, you have to take a step back and look at the broader fabric and understand what draws people into the life of crime in the first place. So the other way Brave capitalizes on this is it builds partnerships across sectors and faiths and walks of life. It creates a safety net to provide resources to young men like Jared. What about his friend who's already embedded within a gang? Well, this same safety net provides free services for health and counseling, for educational assistance and employment assistance to help him walk away from that Plan B life of crime toward a Plan A, healthier, more sustainable life. So I mentioned that this talk was about invisible ties, so I want to connect to that again. Okay, about a year into Brave, we started to see an increase in requests for services. This was great. More people were seeking help. We celebrated this. But then we looked closer and we realized that some of the violent offenders we most wanted to seek services were not. We started to worry that maybe we were doing something wrong. But then we looked closer, this time not at the thread, at the fabric, and we saw that although those individual offenders were not getting help, their younger siblings were, their friends were. Was this a failure? Absolutely not. Because research tells us sometimes the best way to change a behavior is not a direct tie. Sometimes it's surrounding and indirectly enveloping a person with positive influence. Brave's imperative to walk away from a life of crime and start anew was doing exactly what we wanted it to do. It was infusing an invisible network. Since then, remarkable things are happening. Murder is down in the city by over 30%, and people are starting to see the effect of a community intervention. Now, actuaries estimate, though, that the cost of one murder to society is about $17 million. Once you factor in the cost of legal costs, cost of incarceration, loss of productivity to society, and that's not even counting the loss of heart and soul and morale and all those intangible losses. Whose responsibility is it to prevent these losses? And whose responsibility is it to make Jared's life better? You could flip the question, ask it the other way. Who stands to lose the most if nothing happens? Is it the person who loses a life, the family that grieves after, the person who spends his or her life in prison for the rest of their lives? The reality is when you're tied by invisible threads to a broader community, we all lose when Jared loses. whether we know how we're connected, whether we live in this community or not. Likewise, we all win when Jared wins. We all benefit from healthier communities. I mean, they make great places to live and for businesses to invest. Therefore, we all have to be responsible for making our communities more vibrant. Baton Rouge leaders have done a remarkable job of making Brave possible, but we can't depend on them alone. And the good news is we don't have to. Because if you take anything away from this talk, it's that we already have the power to change our communities in the invisible power of social influence. It's by acknowledging that not in my backyard and some other community's issue is fallacy. Someone else's hardship, whether you know how, is inevitably, if not invisibly, your own. The other thing is we all have talents. I mean, for some of us, it's running obscure statistics, but for others, it's being able to connect to strangers or being a good mentor. When you realize that our attitudes and our behaviors and our talents can affect not just the immediate ties that we have, but can send power through the waves of influence to the networks beyond, we realize we can do remarkable things and change with that power of social influence. Together, through the community connections, we can weave a beautiful social tapestry, one thread at a time. Thank you.